In this session, we continue to look at the early modern period, which we're referring to the 17th and 18th century, and looking at some things related to mission work. Some of it will be specifically related to mission work. Some of it will be setting the stage for some things we'll talk about in later sessions. One thing to kind of keep in mind here is the developing situation that is taking place related to colonization in the 17th and 18th century. Since the 1500s, more nations were getting involved in colonial expansion. And we saw how colonial expansion was tied with the development of Catholic missions, specifically in the Americas, although we also saw it taking place in the Far East. But predominantly through the 16th century, a lot of the colonial enterprise was Spanish and Portuguese. But beginning in the 16th century, the 1500s, the French, the English, the Dutch are becoming more active. Now, in the 15th century, the late 15th century, the Pope had released a papal document that had split the Americas between the Spanish and the Portuguese. Essentially, these lands were given to those two empires. For the English and the Dutch especially, they were Protestant, so they didn't really care what the Pope said, but even the French as well ignored it. And so they began to enter into colonialism and move on into developing connections, some of which we've seen. We've talked about the French already. French colonization was small in the 1500s, but began developing in the 1600s, sometimes with the support of the church in France. In 1624, for example, Cardinal Armand de Richelieu became a very important advisor to the king. His main focus was on European power struggles, but he was also instrumental in helping establish institutions that would help the growing number of colonists in Canada. And we talked a little bit about the French Jesuit presence in Canada and how that was different. In 1663, Louis XIV made Canada a royal domain, and that demonstrated how he was beginning to pay more attention to France's colonies. And so by connecting the homeland with these colonies, it brought France a lot of material benefits. But French colonization, the French Empire, never got very large. And of course, we did talk about how the French did send some priests, in addition to traders, governmental officials, etc. The Dutch also started their colonization in the 17th century, most of it in New Netherlands, which became New York. Within a couple of decades, though, the Dutch were out of the colonization scene, largely due to poor management and poor decision making, and so that had an impact that essentially eliminated the Dutch. So a lot of the Dutch in the American colonies ended up under English control, and the Dutch Reformed Church doesn't really develop in the colonies. It was very strong in the Netherlands, but it's not very strong in the colonies. There wasn't as many Dutch immigrating. They already have religious freedom in the Netherlands, and so there wasn't that push like you see in some other places. In our discussions in Survey of Church History, we talked about colonization under specific rulers, how a lot of that developed. But I want to set the stage here for some other things we're going to talk about in the next session, talking about missionary work among Native Americans. And so it's important to see how the English colonial enterprise taps into that. Most of us have heard the story of Massasoit in the Pilgrims' First Thanksgiving in Puritan New England. You know, that's a pretty familiar story for people going through American public school systems and school systems in general. Those early years, those relationships deteriorated more, and as predominantly because of more people coming to the colonies from England, especially with the development of Massachusetts Bay in 1630. Well, the Pequots, one of the major tribes in this area, began to respond aggressively to the Puritans due to how the Puritans treated them, how much of the territory of the Pequots they were taking, and so the relationships deteriorated, leading to the Pequot War in 1637. So Puritans attacked a Pequot fort in 1637, and supposedly it was to be in retaliation for the death of two individuals, two Puritans, who were actually killed by Nyaticks, not Pequots. And so evidently the Puritans didn't even bother to recognize the difference between these two tribes. Ultimately, the Puritan leaders tried to justify or interpreted their actions through comparison with the Israelites conquering Canaan. So sometimes that was used. Other times it was Israel's interactions with the Amalekites and how God wanted them to completely remove the savages from the land, like Saul's told in 1 Samuel 15 when he's told to exterminate the Amalekites. 4 decades later, another sizable battle would break out. The Algonquian tribe was kind of finding themselves squeezed between the Iroquois on the one hand and the English on the other. So they formed a coalition of various tribes that were kind of being decimated by all of this under the leadership of a man named Metacom, who was actually the son of Massasoit. The English called him Philip, and so it's sometimes referred to as Metacom's War or King Philip's War. So in 1675, Metacom burned some English settlements, took captives, and killed hundreds of colonists. Ultimately, the Puritans saw this as God's judgment on them. They felt that they had not been faithful to the covenant that they were called upon to participate in, and so God was now punishing them. Well, ultimately, the English did win King Philip's War, and Metacom was executed in response, but in many respects they lost as well. It cost a sizable amount of money for the English to achieve this victory. And on average, every English family lost at least one close relative. 52 towns were badly burned, 13 were totally destroyed. So this is setting up for us some things that we'll talk about in the next section, but it kind of gives us an idea of what's taking place in the Americas, and largely due to relationships with Native Americans, but also I want us to think about how slavery fits into this as well, because this is the time period where slavery among or in the American colonies will also develop. The seafaring slave trade between Africa and Europe is usually dated to 1441, when a Muslim woman was brought to Portugal. And so during the 1500s, Portugal and Spain forcibly transported millions of Africans to South America and the Caribbean. And so the slave trade was pretty early on in the exploration of the colonies. The first slave in North America is usually dated as 1619 in Virginia, but slaves, of course, had been in South America and in the Caribbean prior to that. And really, Europeans had been involved in trade for a century or more when the slave trade really began to hit its stride. It's also important to see, if we're looking at this from a historical perspective, that slavery and trading in slaves was a part of African culture before it became a major part of interactions with Europeans. So there was internal slavery and slave trading in Africa before the Europeans got involved in it. However, the economics of slave trading changes as the Atlantic world develops. Remember, Atlantic world is the term used to describe the relationships between Europe, the Americas, and Africa. And so as these things developed, that slave trade that was so internal in African culture morphed into this external trade where it becomes more profitable for some people to trade or sell slaves to Europeans. Now, in Africa, there isn't the notions of private land ownership at the time. And basically, it was you had rights to products produced on land. You didn't own the land, but people had certain rights to the products that were produced. So slaveholding was a way to increase what products you were able to produce and harvest, which is why it was important for Africans. Which meant that there were some differences between how Africans viewed slaves and how people in Europe began to view slaves. In Africa, slaves were a sign of status, but essentially slaves were peasant cultivators. It was much like the peasant system set up in Europe in the Middle Ages, so it's a slightly different perspective. Sometimes slaves were to do the jobs that nobody else wanted to do, but other people could be found for those jobs in Africa. For Europe, however, slaves were owned to do the work that no one else would do. So it's a completely different approach to slavery. People didn't want to do it, and so there was this forced element of, okay, here I am, I want to have my crops harvested, I can't find anybody to do it because they want to be paid more than I want to pay them. I'll buy slaves, force the slaves to do that. So because of this structure of slavery already existing and slave trading already existing, it made it easy for the Europeans to tap into it. Now, many of the early slaves tended to come from those taken in warfare and who hadn't found a place in their new communities. And so that's where a lot of the early slaves came. Slavery exports exploded in the 17th century and would grow even larger in the 18th. And really, by the end of the 17th century, Europeans were more open to paying more for slaves as they began to see how slavery could economically impact them. As slaves came to America, they came to work and to serve, largely to bolster the developing American economies. And so it was an economic issue here. And colonial society in the Americas transformed, especially into the 18th century, based on economics of production and the development of cash crop. So when cash crops were present, it made a better economic decision to have slaves so you could have larger harvests and get larger money out of that. If you lived in a region that didn't have a cash crop, there wasn't as much of an interest or an economic push to have slaves. And so this turned, I mean, the North wasn't necessarily in this position of being so racially progressive that slavery ended there because they thought the institution was bad. No, it ended because there wasn't cash crops. There wasn't the tobacco. There wasn't rice. There wasn't indigo. Into the 18th century, there wasn't cotton. Right? And so, you know, that's the large thing that happens here. is that there's not the significant push for a moral ending of slavery in the 17th and into the early 18th century. It's more about economics. Now, many of the slaves who came to the Americas came with their own language, their own philosophy, their own religion. There was a sizable group of slaves who were Muslim. It's estimated that somewhere between 15 to 20% of slaves that come to the colonies, the American colonies, were Muslim. But even though there's, they're bringing over their own language, and even though there's a sizable Islamic presence, it appears that many slaves would have also been familiar to some extent with Christianity, but there weren't too many efforts in the English colonies to convert slaves to Christianity on any sort of sizable scale or in any united way. Additionally, through this time period, it also became apparent to Europeans that Native American slavery was not going to be a suitable economic opportunity. Okay. Native Americans could more easily escape because they knew the terrain. Additionally, a lot of Native Americans were devastated by European diseases. Not so much the case with Africans. And again, with slave trading already in existence, a lot of the people that came over that were enslaved were used to certain types of work. Native Americans were not. And so, again, another one of these considerations was not so much a moral issue, but it was an economic issue of, is this what's better economically? There were, however, some differences between Christians about some of these issues. Bartolomé de las Casas, for example, was opposed to Native American slavery. However, it doesn't seem like he was necessarily opposed to slavery in general. So you have some Christians who are completely open to slavery, certain Christians that aren't approving of certain types of slavery, others that are not comfortable with slavery. And again, the conditions that were in existence related to slavery. As Christians today, we look back and how could anybody justify that? When you think of something like the Middle Passage, this slave route that developed by the late 16th century, where Africans are put on ships with these having to live through these terrible conditions, and they're packing as many slaves as possible, and they're experiencing disease and death. How can you think? How can this be acceptable? Well, it was a different world. It doesn't make it right, but it was a different world. And so we need to understand that. Another area that was different had to do with slave families. Some areas in the colonies, the Americas, imported slaves from both sexes and encouraged slave families. Others did not. For those that encouraged slave families, depending on the imperial power, some, especially Catholic imperial power, some would be married according to the church's rituals by a priest. So you have some differences over the condition of slavery. Is it a moral thing? Families, all sorts of different things marked slavery as different among Christians, but there's not a sustained push in this time period we're talking about for an ending to slavery, or that somehow there's an absolute tidal wave of opposition to it. Also during this period, we begin to see the beginnings of modern African Christianity. If you remember way back to those early centuries, Christianity had spread across northern Africa, was present in a lot of places there. We talked about some figures, both in Surveying Church History and in this course, figures who were born and lived in Africa, who taught and preached in Africa. But with the advent of Islam, Christianity in Africa had largely vanished until some of those later centuries in the Middle Ages that we talked about, as some Catholic missionaries attempted to move in there to varying success, as we noted. But really in the 16th and 17th century, you start to see the redevelopment of a modern African Christianity, or sometimes a slave Christianity. And in many respects, there were some elements of Christianity and some elements of Christianity and indigenous African traditions that probably facilitated the conversion, or at least the development of an African Christianity. In many respects, both groups believed in an unseen realm. Right? So you're not trying to convince Africans, or you're not trying to convince slaves that there is an unseen realm that is real, and that also, there's a need to receive revelation from this unseen realm. Now, certainly, there were differences. A lot of African peoples believed that there was continuous revelation, while a lot of Christians, especially Protestants, emphasized the importance of the completeness of revelation in the Bible. Often, those visions of this unseen realm that Africans continued to have into the modern period were more welcome among European Catholics because it bordered on mysticism than European Protestants, who where mysticism wasn't ever really a large trajectory. Ultimately, though, a lot of the slave Christianity that developed was a hybrid form of Christianity, where there were Christian concepts, saints, other people kind of connected with, connected with African views. Right? So this African spirit being or deity is connected with this particular saint. So by the 17th century, these commonalities, right, the belief in two worlds, this world, the unseen world, the belief in revelations, these kind of things are facilitating this development. Now, a lot of African religious systems didn't have a powerful priesthood, and so that made it difficult for some evangelizing, the little that was done. And, when it comes to conversion, right, and as this encounter between 18th century Africans and Christianity, you have this adopting some aspects of Christianity, incorporating some of their traditional practices in this hybrid. But, conversion is something that is happening in Africa, it's coming over. But largely, Europeans don't have very high views of African systems, African religions. For them, Christianity is, of course, the highest, most advanced religion, and indigenous religions were superstitious and primitive. And so there's not an effort here, like what we saw with some of the pietist missionaries, of trying to understand the worldview, of trying to find ways to understand the people that they're trying to evangelize, because first of all, there isn't a concern for evangelism, it's about enslavement. And so, their views are superstitious, they're primitive, they're illiterate, and so there isn't a very important interest in this. But in the 18th century, there began to be a concern for these people, these individuals held in chattel slavery. What do you do about their souls? So in 1701, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts was started with the goal of sending Anglican clergy, church members of the Church of England, preachers of the Church of England, to the Americas for missionary work. Ultimately, there's not a significant impact made by Anglicans. They don't, I mean, there is some. More successful, we'll see, are Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, largely late 18th, early 19th century. But here's an effort where the Anglican Church in England says, all right, we need to send people to try and convert the slaves. And the Society for Propagation of the Gospel also sent people to other places as well. But the greater concern happened when they began to be thinking about this issue. Does that mean that if someone is converted, that their baptism would require them to set their slaves free? Well, eventually the Europeans decided no. Baptizing slaves didn't change their social status, and in fact laws were passed in the early 18th century in many states to claim just that. Baptism did not lead to freedom. In fact, some ministers required slaves to agree that baptism didn't free them before they were baptized. And so you had to essentially agree to that. Again, Anglicans, they preached a lot of sermons. A lot of the sermons focused on things like servants obey your masters, don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat. But especially for those slaves born in Africa, there wasn't much of a success in converting Africans. More success was evident among the evangelicals. They, at least visibly, were more converting to Baptist churches, Methodist churches, etc. So there's a lot of hesitancy here by slaves to accept this message, right? The hypocrisy of these white Christians holding people in slavery, yet also talking about this message, was something that was a challenge for a lot of conversionary type of efforts. Another reason that evangelicals were successful was that they were willing to license slave preachers. Not just slave preachers, people of African descent. The Anglicans would not. And so that provided another opportunity for evangelicals to have some success here. Most of the practice of slave Christianity in the 18th century, however, was largely European in outlook. It was shaped by European interests. The 19th century is more where we see truly African American Christianity that develops its own customs and things like that are based more on influence from African traditions and customs rather than the European approach. Now, some slaves did welcome the opportunities for instruction. Now, some of it was more pragmatic, right? And so the opportunity to miss work to go hear this preacher was, okay, yeah, I'll go listen to this guy. You don't have to work in the fields or whatever. But it also, provided the opportunity for some slaves to feel superior to their masters in that they were seeking out ways to be better Christians than their masters. It allows them to judge their masters by practicing the white master's religion better than he did. And so some looked at it as that. Some took that opportunity to do that. Others, however, saw it as a means of rebellion. And it provides the impetus for some people to actually rebel, cause revolts, etc. There were some free blacks in the North who eventually started their own denominations, many of them usually within parent denominations. One of the earliest is developments. Some of the earliest are ones developed by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Allen was born a slave in Philadelphia. His master was a lawyer and later Chief Justice. He ends up being sold, along with his family, to a planter in Delaware. So he moves from Philadelphia to Delaware. And he would end up converting to Methodism, becomes very active in preaching, and preaches to his siblings and others. Eventually, his master would allow Richard to bring in preachers, and ultimately he would hear one of these preachers and become convinced that slaveholding is wrong. Allen would eventually be able to purchase his freedom. The laws, some laws prohibiting some things prevented his master from just freeing him. So his master encouraged Allen to work for revolutionary forces in order to gain enough money to be free, which he does. He starts preaching and traveling, preaching to whites, to blacks. He will end up starting the Free African Society with Absalom Jones. That's how the two of them can connect. And it's basically a means for free blacks, and slaves as well, to help each other out economically or in other ways. They both continue to preach, gain quite a few converts, and eventually, due to some treatment that Jones and Allen received from white church members in Philadelphia, kind of forcing them to sit in the back, up the stairs, kind of away from, or further back from the front. They decide to leave, start their own denomination. They first start the African Church out of the Free African Society. They will later rename that the Bethel African Church. But there's a division as far as which denomination are we going to associate with. Allen wants to be Methodist. Jones wanted to be Episcopalian. And so Allen and Jones will actually become the first African-American Episcopal priest. Allen will start the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so largely, you have these new denominations developing, you have black churches, etc. Another important impact of this time period that will have significance with later efforts at missions is the development of evangelicalism. And in some respects, we've highlighted some of this in Survey of Church History, and we've highlighted some as well in Restoration Movement. But I want to refresh your memory about some of these things. The phrase, the term that gets translated evangelical, became a popular term during the Reformation. Protestants, especially Luther, used that term, which, as you know, coming from the Greek word for gospel, connected to the words evangelize, evangelist. Luther uses this term to describe their reforms. And it's often in contrast to the Catholic approach. So, when the Reformers used it, they meant justification by faith in opposition to justification by works. They meant to depend solely on Christ instead of human priests in the church. They meant it to suggest the once for all death of Christ on the cross, the priesthood of all believers, all of those kind of concepts. And that, in continental Europe, that's the way that term continued to be used, and it is even still in use today that way. However, in the 18th century in Britain and its colonies, it began to take on a new meaning, largely due to the influence of Pietism and its emphasis on the inward spiritual life, an active day-to-day Christianity, a focus on the Bible. These were the things that led people to the development of an approach to Christianity that would eventually be called evangelicalism. It was a movement that developed within the state churches as well as within independent churches like the Baptists. And there were several strands in this evangelical impulse that was present in Presbyterian churches in Scotland, Anglican churches, Congregationalist churches. And so in Anglo-Protestant Christianity, you have this development of what we call evangelicalism today. And related to pietism, related to this Reformed approach to Christianity, you have a variety of things that emphasize or create a transformation into evangelicalism. One, kind of, again, coming from the influence of pietism, is how Christian faith is about correct living. Right? And so, certainly you see this in Scripture, so it's not like it's a completely new development, but the notion that Christian faith is evidenced not so much in doctrine and doctrinal precision, but in correct living. A second transformation that takes place in Anglo-Protestantism is an emphasis more on godly fellowship than godly order in society. We don't really take too much time to talk about the Puritans in this point, but if you think back to some of the things we talked about with the Puritans, shaped by Calvin, are very concerned about order in society, godly order in society. The evangelicals are concerned about that as well to some extent in the 18th century, less so than evangelicals in the 19th and 20th centuries. Instead, it's more about associating with godly people. A third transformation was the belief in individual interpretation, that people can interpret the Bible for themselves and can interpret it properly. And then a fourth transformation is the way in which preaching takes place. Instead of preaching, the focus of preaching being exposition of Scripture or logical development of points, the focus is on appealing to people through these passionate sermons to get right with Christ. That's more of the attention, is sermons that will affect the emotions, not sermons that necessarily are the most erudite in their rhetoric. So during this time, you see kind of flowing out of these ideas an increase in devotional literature in English. Right? Literature meant to foster a personal and emotional connection to God. This helps this transformation along. The concern to evangelize comes out of this, not just preach. The concern for mission activity, as we've seen, has kind of waxed and waned in Christianity. Well, in places where there were state churches, evangelizing was rather lax because it doesn't matter whether somebody's a Christian or not. The church still gets the funds. So you have this interest in evangelizing out of this, because this is a new way of thinking about this. And so, there's this notion of needing to bring this message, this evangelical message, to people for conversion. Right? The needing to convert, people needing to convert, having an identifiable conversion experience. And so this preference for emotion, the insistence on the conversion experience, this Reformed view of Scripture, right, all kind of marks these people under this umbrella term, evangelicals. Right? So it covers this impulse in a variety of denominations. And often this evangelical impulse in the 18th century found expressions of it in intense moments of religious conviction, religious participation, known as revivals. Now, revivals, there had been some presence of revivals throughout the 18th century, but really the ones in the 1730s were different because of their intensity, the publicity that was related to this, and the frequency in which they happened. And so later people would refer to this period as the Great Awakening. Historians, however, have challenged the usefulness of that term, given that the revivals before, there were revivals after, and so to really kind of pinpoint this is not historically sound, but it also should be recognized that there is such an increase and focus in the middle here of the 18th century. The first round of this revivals in the middle part here was shaped by Jonathan Edwards in New England. So, you know, he sees his church going Arminian, and Edwards is a good Calvinist, and so he begins preaching on the importance of God's salvation, the importance of election, and, you know, kind of rejecting the idea of human works or virtue. Well, in the early 1730s, Edwards saw a lot of concern in his congregation about matters of salvation. Everybody seemed to be interested in the relationship to God, their eternal destinies, and so revivals spread throughout Massachusetts and Connecticut with his preaching, the preaching of others. He would later judge them to be false because they don't result in any significant transformation of people's lives. But there are large numbers of conversions, increases in attendance that really helps people think, okay, there's something significant taking place here. He'll write about it, and he'll write a faithful narrative of the surprising work of God, talking about these revivals, how important they are, the significance of them, how they happened, and it gets published, of course, in the Americas, but it also gets published in England and Scotland. And so this revivalism is transatlantic. It's not just in the American colonies. It's not just in New England. Things happen in Britain as well. And, you know, at this time, the Wesleys are coming over with their trips. And so there's a lot of involvement here. One of the Wesley's close associates, who had been part of the Holy Club, was a man named George Whitefield, and he participates in this as well. Whitefield had grown up around and in the theater. He would later condemn it. And while he's at Oxford, joins the Holy Club, becomes convinced of the need for conversion, and would eventually become a traveling evangelist. But he's one of these people that prefers to preach to encourage these emotional responses. He also tends to speak without notes, which is also different than a lot of other, especially Anglican clergy at the time. He's just kind of extemporaneously preaching. A main focus of his preaching was this emotional appeal to people to experience the new birth. Now, the Anglican approach, as we said before, the Anglican approach was to encourage people to conform to the doctrines of Anglicanism, the 39 Articles it was called. And people that didn't conform to that were nonconformists or dissenters. So here's Whitefield as an Anglican minister, and he's not talking about conforming to doctrine, he's talking about this new birth experience. And so this is a very important difference that's taking place here. He begins to travel to the British colonies. Between 1738 and 1770, he would take 5 tours, visiting every colony. And in that, you know, he was engaged in a couple of things that helped spur on the development of evangelicalism. One thing that was significant about Whitefield was he was interdenominational. Despite being an Anglican, he would preach for anybody. Now, because of his preaching styles, a lot of Anglican churches in the colonies didn't want him coming, and so he'd be kept from their pulpits. Well, the Baptist church might welcome him, or he might just go out in the field and preach. And so, you know, Whitefield didn't care who he's preaching for. He just took the opportunity to preach to whoever was willing to listen. And a lot of people came to listen. He spoke to crowds of thousands, 8,000, 12,000, sometimes even up to 20,000 people. Scholars estimate that at least a quarter of the people in British North America had heard Whitefield speak at some point. So he was very, very popular. And with that, he brought in new preaching styles. He was animated, where the traditional style was to be very, very somber. It was to not be very dynamic. Whitefield is very animated, waving his arms, pointing at people. Instead of filling your sermon with not only scripture but references to classical learning, Whitefield got all of that out in his preaching, trying to make it accessible to the common people. He was very charismatic. People were just so moved by the way in which he spoke that they were emotionally drawn to the message that Whitefield had. But he was also very shrewd when it came to publicity. He was not against promoting himself or his message. He would write journals of the places that he would visit and then publish them. And people in the 18th century, there's not a lot going on. There's newspapers, there is some literature, but as far as like gripping literature, right? The journals of Whitefield were, for a lot of people, this kind of, oh, what's going on type of thing. He would publish newspaper reports to advertise where he'd been, what he'd been doing, where he was going, so that people could travel to see him or hear him. Now, in some ways, we might say, well, these are some positive developments. And they are positive in the sense of, this will be a transformation that will carry on into the 19th century and how people will become very, very interested in mission work and sharing some of these things because of the motivation they have out of this. But there was controversy that took place. There was controversy between revivalists, who sometimes became known as New Lights, and traditionalists who tended to prefer more rational approaches to religion. They were known as Old Lights. Evangelicals were often very critical of ministers this time. They spoke very harshly about them and their credentials. And really, evangelicals were open to recognizing just about anyone as a minister, even without training, which further angered the traditionalists. So, there's some class conflict here because evangelicalism is developing among the lower classes, and this causes people to look at them as rising above their station. A lot of the clergy are middle to upper class. Additionally, the Old Lights felt that this appeal to the emotional and what they saw as excessive emotionality undermined church authority, and so it was problematic in that way as well. In the South, evangelicals experienced tension, often between the upper-class Anglicans and the lower-class evangelicals. It was the lower classes that were joining the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and some Methodists. And so here you have lower classes. Evangelical preachers are preaching against the immorality of the rich, and they were preaching equality, and so that's deemed offensive as well. Many of these preachers are unlicensed by the Anglican Church, and so that is against the law as well. So there was a lot of tension in this 18th century period between evangelicals and Anglicans. Furthermore, you do have a variety of people that were really excessive in all of this. And a good example of this is James Davenport. Davenport was a preacher in Rhode Island and Connecticut. He's one of those that really goes out and attacks what he calls unconverted ministers, these people that don't have this conversion experience. Well, he's arrested for itinerant preaching going around preaching instead of being located in a church. He's released. He decides to go to Boston, where he does the same thing. In Boston, they declare him to be insane and kick him out of the city. At another place, he encourages the burning of books and wigs, rings, other things that he determines are vain, and so he convinces this church to bring all their stuff together to have a big bonfire. Some claimed he even tried to take off his pants as vain and tried to burn them, but he's prohibited from doing so. Later, he would kind of recant some of these things, and he does kind of settle into a located ministry. But it's these kind of things, the extremes, that really help the old lights, kind of be more against evangelicals or the new lights. So again, a lot of what we're saying here is setting the stage for later mission work, although evangelicalism, right, Whitfield's doing mission work in a sense, Edwards is doing mission work, others are doing this kind of evangelizing as evangelicalism is beginning, and it's the evangelicals that are more open to, as we mentioned, preaching to slaves, trying to convert slaves, but this will set the stage for a lot of interest in foreign missions, and that's where we'll kind of move in the next couple of sessions to talking about, although the next session will focus more on the development of missions to Native Americans. So we'll backtrack a little bit to get to the same time period, but look at some of these efforts to evangelize among Native Americans.